Hello and welcome to a mythical writing workshop for a new possibility. My name is Hannah, and our July workshop this year is on the theme, the inner kitchen. So I wanted to give a little bit of context to why I chose this, and there's actually a few things that came together. So I'll start here. This seems as good a place as any. So several months ago, I was talking to one of my mentors, Lori Deshar, who's actually one of the founders of A New Possibility, the platform here. And I was describing a dream to her, which really just seemed like a replay of my waking life, which was I was in the kitchen scrambling around. My family or guests were in the other room, and something was burning, something fell on the floor, nothing was clean when I needed it to be. And I was just so frustrated and so exhausted and so disappointed because if you've ever cooked a large meal for a lot of people, you get excited and then quickly disappointed when all goes awry. So my initial thought was you know, I'm stressed out because none of my dishes are done and I have to clean, I have to clean and cook and do things for a lot of people. Even when I'm by myself, I feel I can never catch up. And she was the one to remind me that kind of in this element of archetypal psychology, depth psychology, or kind of post-Jungian psychology, there's a theme of cooking in the kitchen being related to the unconscious, either the collective unconscious or the personal unconscious or subconscious. And so it may have been true in my waking life, but Lori was also quick to point out to me that there was a lot going on in my inner kitchen, and I couldn't keep up with my own psyche and what was developing in my dreams and going on underneath of the surface. And this image here is from an alchemical text, exhorting alchemists to go to do, in here it says the women's work, but in other words, to go into the kitchen, um, either into their alchemist lab or into the kitchen of their soul in order to do the physical and spiritual transformational work associated with alchemy. And, I won't pretend to know everything about alchemy. Oh, sorry. Let me go back one. I won't pretend to know everything about alchemy, and there is a lot of information, but taking this not as a historical pseudoscience that was later discredited, but more, as people who are active on this platform, A New Possibility, are very aware, as a metaphorical and spiritual journey of the soul through different levels of consciousness and turning our base material, um, the so-called lead, through a refinement process, through many refinement processes into gold. And there's a lot of different texts on alchemy, and alchemical practices are also found across cultures and spiritual traditions. And that's how Carl Jung came into that for his purposes. So the four essential processes are labeled after colors: Nigredo, Albedo, Citrinus, and Rubedo. The idea of the black decay, the white purification, the yellow of the dawn of enlightenment, and then the red of fulfillment, integration, and relationship. From that, more processes are listed under subcategories, some of which you may have heard before, like calcination, dissolution, separation, conjunction, putrefaction, coagulation. Uh, so the purpose of this workshop and presentation today isn't to go into a lot of depth, either historically or technically, but to think of this metaphorically. And if you're here or watching this, you probably already see the connection between this and cooking. And obviously, cooking and preparing food, whoever does it, of whatever gender, is an essential task of survival. And by extension, the inner work that we do in our souls and in our subconscious, spiritually, and depending spiritual, I'm using in a very general sense. It could be connected to a religion or just in terms of your self-improvement and your own maturation toward a higher or more mature self in terms of personal transformation. So you can take this on whatever you want. But the idea here is that um, just like cooking or working in a kitchen or working in a lab requires time, attention, dedication, preparation, um, constancy. So does the work of our soul, and both are necessary for our survival, whether we think so or not. Um, and another thing I wanted to bring up on why I chose this topic has to do with a particular story that I'm going to tell later, and some context of how it entered and re-entered my life. So, uh, almost 10 years ago, maybe 8 or so years ago, I was going through a really dark stage in my life, where a couple things happened at once. There was a disillusionment with an academic program I was in. There was a romantic disappointment and disillusionment and separation that happened, among other things. And in that time, I actually was working in a kitchen. I worked in a couple kitchens um, in my life. I'm really not very good at it as far as speed and professionalism goes. I like to cook. But at that time, I was actually working in a bakery, and it was the second time I'd worked in a bakery. Um, I was also introduced to Michelle Talker, who does work with myths and fairy tales. She's a writer and an artist, and she has a self-study course in fairy tales called Wonderlit. And I was interviewing her for a project that I was doing for school. And uh, I was telling her about this dark time in my life, not even specifically, but I really mentioned some things about the relationship and my graduate studies. And sh I think she asked me if there was a particular image from a fairy tale, because that was the topic that our interviews had been on, that stuck with me. And I said I couldn't remember the book, but when I was a kid, I was fascinated by this picture book, a fairy tale of a princess who had to go into hiding, and she had these dresses, and she had to wear all these different animal furs. And the image in my mind was of her after she had run away in a castle and was sleeping in a tree. And that was all that I remembered. It was like a dream image from my early childhood. And Michelle Talker knew the story. She knew exactly the story that I was talking about, whose German name I find it difficult to pronounce. I think it's Allerleirauh, or it's translated as all furs or all kinds of furs, and it's in the Grimm Brothers collection. So that story was introduced, and within a few months, I was also talking to a colleague at work, another writer and student and scholar, about some things happening. I hadn't mentioned this story to her at all, and she suggested that I read Leaving My Father's House by Marion Woodman. And that book focuses on the story of all furs and the amplification of it through depth psychology, kind of a Jungian approach, and also her looking at some of her dreams and her clients' dreams over time. So this constellation of things happened. And when I get to the story and talk more, I'll kind of talk some of the ways that it paralleled my life. But I wanted to give that context before I read some excerpts from Leaving My Father's House, that same book that was recommended to me. Anything here with a grain of salt. Um, so Marion Woodman, in the context of this excerpt, was describing a time in her life when she was younger, when she was still a student, and seeing an analyst and how hard she worked to impress them with how much she knew, and could tell her analyst all about her problems before he could open his mouth. And um, when she's reflecting on that, this is what she says. She says, What was missing in my desperate effort was the soul work in the kitchen. In those days, my inflated spirit was flying. My repressed instincts were caged. Both were cut off from my soul and body. Culturally, the kitchen work is still not being done, and therefore, furs and gowns are reduced to a masquerade, costumes that cannot hide emptiness. Without the diligence to bite off, chew, swallow, digest, and assimilate the new energy available in the kitchen, the ego is often too weak. Certainly, it is too lethargic to build a fire. Without fire, no transformation can take place. This is from the same work. Many young and old visionaries thirst for an ideal world that they do not associate with the necessity of their own hard work. When they look at the news or watch an ecological program, their dreams are shattered. They feel powerless. Their energy swings into rage or escape, sadism, sexuality, or sleep. The kitchen work is the anchor that is missing in this kind of swinging from light to dark. Energy that is not allowed to transform toward creativity too often finds a destructive outlet. Here she talks about the context of kitchen work and interpersonal relationships. She says, working it through, fighting, holding firm, reflecting, meditating, being patient, leads to initiation. Sifting through the ashes of our broken hopes, empty stereotypes, inflated ideals, we let the dead world go, and at the same time, attend to the new energy flowing in from life's source. And I'm going to shift a little bit and just staying on this imagery of alchemy, cooking, inner work, and all of the literal and metaphorical amplifications, places we could go with that. Another image that came to mind was from the I Ching. So, again, viewers and listeners might already be familiar with the I Ching, which is a divination practice. It's about 3,000 years old at least, originating in China. And you would either throw yarrow stalks or coins or, have an app on your phone. And it's like the idea is that you would toss the coins or do whatever you were doing 6 times. And how the coins landed would be a solid line or a broken line, a yin or a yang line. And then the six lines is a hexagram, and the hexagram contains 2 trigrams. And all of the possible trigrams, there's 8 of them. They are a relationship in a family. So mother, father, or the 3 daughters or the 3 sons. So this is hexagram 63, which is I've seen translated a number of ways. Uh, I've seen it translated as after fulfillment, already completed, already across. And the 2 trigrams at the bottom is the middle daughter, uh, which is represented by the element of fire. And the upper trigram is the middle sun, which is represented by water and specifically the depths or the abyss. So over here on this other, in the other corner, you can see the 2 elements. And I'm sorry, I couldn't find the artist for this image. It was on an online like forum posted. So this is considered, in this, it's the 2 elements are considered in harmony with each other, and the yin and yang lines are in their proper places. And I won't go too deep kind of into the technical aspects of the I Ching here, but the idea is that the big task that you're doing, and it's often the metaphor in the I Ching of crossing a river or crossing a great body of water, which was a very difficult task before bridges or modern engineering. So the idea is that this task is completed. The major goal you had or the thing you wanted to do is done. the natural tendency of fire is to go up and water is to go down, but here they're reversed. So there's kind of an equilibrium that's achieved, but it's a delicate equilibrium. Um, and that these two these two elements have to stay in harmony, which is where the metaphor of the cooking comes from, or the pot over the fire, that you can see in the image, that the fire must be tended so that it doesn't go out and in the process too soon, but it mustn't burn too hot or it'll evaporate the water and crack the vessel. And that's another alchemical image that you often see of the vessel or the crucible that holds, has to stay in place and stay in integrity for the process to happen and the vessel not to be destroyed. So it's the same idea here, that even when things are quote unquote finished, they're never really finished. You have to attend to what you've created. And I'll read from the Alfred Wang translation of this, the decision and the image that goes with this hexagram. So he translates it as already fulfilled. And he says, or he translates it, already fulfilled, even the little being prosperous and smooth, favorable to be steadfast and upright, beginning, good fortune, end, disorder. And then the commentary on the image. Water over fire, an image of already fulfilled. In correspondence with this, the superior person contemplates the law of waxing and waning and takes preventative measures against possible decline. And he says in his own commentary, he says, beyond the climax, every perfect condition alternates to its opposite. For this reason, the sages advised extreme caution. They understood that in a perfect situation, there is still some imperfection. They purposefully made progress in small steps and achieved moderate success. They remained steadfast and upright. They acted to keep the good fortune at the beginning from becoming disorder in the end, which is another theme in this hexagram. Order doesn't last, and if you're not careful, it could alternate to disorder very quickly without your attention and care. And you may already know that this is the next to last hexagram in the entire series. So this is number 63. Number 64 is not yet completed or not yet across, which is the opposite. Water as the lower trigram and fire as the upper. And that's the idea of before things come into equilibrium. And there's a lot of commentary, a lot of scholars and different people have written on the I Ching, and that it's deliberately not yet completed is the last hexagram because nothing is ever complete, and that no state of perfection can remain. So, and I think I'm going to pause there before I go and share the story, but that was just a little background and context to get us in the mood for the fairy tale that'll come next. So I'll pause and we can have a discussion. All right. So we're back, and I'm going to give my best rendition of the story of Allerleirauh. I'm going to call her All Furs during this, so I don't have to mispronounce that every time. And this was a fairy tale I encountered as a young child that I forgot until recently in my adult life. And ever since I was reintroduced to it via Michelle Talker, it's everywhere. So without further mention, I'll begin. So once upon a time, in whatever fairy tale land we assume that this is, there was a king who had a wife with beautiful golden hair, and they had a young daughter. And the wife was very sick. And as she was dying, the queen called the king into her bedchamber and made him promise that after she died, he would never marry unless it was a woman just as beautiful as her with the same beautiful golden hair. And even though at the time he couldn't imagine marrying again at all, he agreed to this promise. So the queen died, and years went by. And after some time, the counselors and ministers of the king were like, Sir, it's been too long. You need to marry again. There needs to be a queen. Your daughter needs a mother. And they were pressuring him. And around this same time, or perhaps a little bit later, he noticed that one day he just noticed that his daughter was developing, and she had actually become the image of her mother. And of all the women, she was the only one that was as beautiful as the late queen with the same long golden hair. And the king fell in love with the princess, his own daughter, and informed his counselors and his ministers that he intended to marry his daughter. They were, of course, shocked and opposed this. And of course, the daughter, the princess, was also shocked and opposed this. In other words, said, this is unnatural. This goes against God's law. You can't marry your own daughter. But the king was set on it. So the princess tried to escape this plan. So the first thing she did was she decided to ask her father for impossible gifts, that she wouldn't marry him until she had made for her a dress as golden as the sun, another dress as silver as the moon, and another dress as bright as the stars. Well, he managed to get those for her. And then she asked us for a second thing. She asked for a mantle, I guess a coat made for her with fur from every animal in the kingdom. Had to have at least one piece of fur from every animal in the kingdom in this coat. And she thought, well, that'll get him. He's never going to be able to do that. Yet, some time passed, and he was. And when he gave her the mantle of 1,000 different furs, he said to her, tomorrow we will be wed. So the princess was not on board with this plan. So that evening, the day before, the night before their wedding, the wedding with her father, she gathered her dresses together, which she had also requested that they I think she had requested they had be so thin that they could pass through a ring. So they were so thin that she was able to fold them up and put them inside of a nutshell. And she was also able to pack away a golden ring, a golden spinning wheel, and a golden reel. And I think she had got from her mother. And she put on the mantle of the 1,000 furs, and she blackened her face with soot. And she escaped off into the forest that evening. In the forest, she came upon a tree, and being cold and scared and having nowhere else to sleep, she crawled into the tree and slept there during the night. The next morning, the king of this neighboring land that she was in, the king of that forest, was hunting. And with his ministers and huntsmen about, they came upon the tree where All Furs was sleeping. And they had no idea even what this creature was or whether it was human. And having nothing else to do, she said, please take pity on me. I'm poor and wretched and have no mother and father. Uh, and the king said, we'll send her to the kitchen to do the dirtiest work. And that's where she was. So she assumed a role as a kitchen wretch, I guess, always wearing her fur mantle, doing the dirtiest work, and having nothing but a little cupboard to sleep at night. And time passed, and no one had any idea of her true identity, and she probably even forgot who she really was. as she labored in the kitchen. However, after some time had passed, a great feast was coming, a great festival or ball, it's usually a ball, we'll use that word, was coming to the castle. And Allfurs, the kitchen wretch, asked the head cook if she could just go up for a little while to watch the festivities, because and he begrudgingly allowed it because she had been working so hard. And he said to her, you get half an hour, 30 minutes to watch, and then you must come down and help make dinner for the king. And when you come down, I'll go up and watch for a little while. So she agreed. And unbeknownst to anybody, she went into her little, cupboard where she was sleeping, and she took off her fur mantle and she washed her face and her skin, and she put on the dress as golden as the sun. And she went out into the ball, and nobody recognized her. Nobody recognized this beautiful young woman, and she got the attention of the king. So the king was enchanted by her. They danced, but as the 30 minutes were nearing, she made an excuse and slipped away before he could detain her for any longer, and went back into the kitchen where the cook told her that, the chef, the head chef told her to prepare the bread soup for the king's dinner. So while the chef was upstairs, watching the festivities for a little while, Allfurs worked on the bread soup for the king. And in the bottom of the king's bowl of soup, she placed the golden ring from her mother that she had brought with her. So as the king was eating the bread soup, he was amazed by how delicious it was. And he also found the ring at the bottom of the bowl. So immediately he called the chef and he said, "Did you make this soup?" And the chef was like, "Yes." And the king called his bluff. He said, "No, you didn't, because it's better than any soup you have ever made before." And the chef admitted that it wasn't him who made the soup. It was the orphan wretch that lived in the kitchen. Um, and the king said, "Please bring her up." So the chef went down into the kitchen and scolded Allfurs and says, "The king wants to talk to you. Did you drop a hair in the soup like I told you not to? If he complains, you'll never make the soup again." So Allfurs comes up in her mantle, um, and everything dirty with soot, and bows before the king. And the king questions her, "Did you make this soup?" And she says, "Yes." And he says, "Well, who are you?" She says, I'm nothing but a poor orphan girl with no mother and no father." And he says, "Well, what use do we have for you in the palace?" And she says, um, "I am no good for anything except to have boots thrown at my head." And he replies, Do you know anything about this ring that, ended up in my soup?" And she says, "No, I know nothing about the ring." And he says, "All right." And he lets her go. So you can imagine what happens next. More time passes. Another ball comes to the palace, and Allfurs asks the chef again, "May I please go upstairs? May I please have a break from the kitchen, at least for a little while, to see the festivities?" And he allows her, the 30 minutes. She goes back into her cupboard where she scrubs her hands and face, takes off the mantle of 1,000 furs, and puts on the dress that's as silvery as the moon. She goes up into the palace. The king sees her immediately. They dance together. Um, he's even more enchanted. And then, as 30 minutes go by or get closer, she slips away and goes back into the kitchen to put back on the fur mantle and to make the bread soup for the king that the chef has asked her to make because the king likes it so much. So she makes the soup for the king, and in this bowl, she drops the golden spinning wheel. The king is eating the soup. He comes upon the spinning wheel. He asks the chef to ask the chef who made the soup. He said it was all furs. The poor girl that lives, the poor girl in the kitchen. They bring her back up. The same set of questions. Who, who are you? What use are you in my palace? She repeats, I'm good for nothing except to have boots thrown at my head. He asks her about the golden spinning wheel. She claims ignorance. He lets her go. Some more time passes, and yet again, another ball is happening at the palace. Um, Allfurs asks the chef if she can watch, and he says yes, but only for 30 minutes because then you have to come back here and make this soup that the king likes so much. So don't be late. So she goes upstairs in the dress that's bright as the stars, and she dances with the king once more. But um, the king is on to her, and while she is not looking or not paying too much attention, he slips a golden ring upon her finger. The 30 minutes are up. He tries to prevent her from getting away from him, but she manages to escape. But she's right up against the time now. She's actually running a little late. So she doesn't have time to change completely out of the dress that's as bright as the stars. So she dirties her face and hands, throws the cloak of the mantle of 1,000 furs over the dress, and comes back up into the kitchen. They begin the interrogation again. However, this time, when the king asks who she is and about the what's been dropped in the soup, he won't let her evade the question. And in fact, as she is lying to him, he snatches the hand that still has the ring on it, and to prove his point. And the mantle of all the 1,000 furs um, comes open, and they see the dress bright as stars underneath. And he says, I know who you are. You are the queen, and you are my wife. And they're married that night. And they apparently live happily ever after, or whatever version of that you can attain in these stories. The end of the story.
Yours, I can still see you.
So we're back from a brief discussion, and I wanted to share some of the things that we said. So one thing that is very disturbing to a lot of people, including me, is the incest element in this story. And there's actually a couple fairy tales that have that, particularly between a king and his daughter, the princess. So yes, it could be interpreted literally, and that does happen. And even to put that as a warning or kind of a message in a children's story, I can see. Um, Marion Woodman and others, however, think about this in terms, one of a parentified child, and that happens quite often in real life and in children's stories where a parent dies and a child has to fulfill the role of the parent. Usually it's not as extreme as marrying the surviving parent, but you can see that here. She's expected to assume her mother's place. Um, and that happens a lot in real life. Children get parentified often for many reasons. Marion Woodman in Leaving My Father's House, which is the book that she wrote, amplifying and exploring this story through her own life and that of her patients, talks about, even the father's house in the title is like a patriarchal institution or structure. And not even just one house, one school, one government, but just the world that we live in. And that because the princess is so bright, and we might also, and in addition to her beauty, we may also assume, talented, intelligent, different things. Physical beauty is often used in fairy tales as kind of a catch-all for moral virtue as well. Again, just like the gender thing, this can lead to a lot of stereotypes or misconceptions, but it's often kind of one of these shorthand symbolic things. But, she catches the eye of the patriarchal institution, or she catches the eye of the father with a capital F. And she's expected to play a role that she doesn't want, because other people have deemed it fitting. And from that, she escapes. And part of the thing that I get into the story is that her father unknowingly gives her the gifts, unknowingly allow her to survive and adapt in a new environment. Um, so unbeknownst to him, he is helping her through these requests. And even that there's something that can be salvaged or taken from an outdated institution or worldview, that it can help you into something else. And when I use like patriarchy as an overarching term, it's I'm using it, and I think Marion Woodman is too, again, that's a, to be simplistic or reductionist, but the idea is that it's beyond gender, that it's a worldview and an institution that demands of men, women, and all genders to function in a certain way that has become over time corroded and toxic, and um, often leads to power and domination. And that men, women, children, anybody um, can be hurt by it and seek to escape. So not just to read it literally as a daughter being oppressed or taken advantage of by the father, but also the role that we play in social institutions and when we decide we're not going to play them anymore. So another thing that came up in the conversation, it's a very astute observation that each of the different dresses relates to different stages of her maturation and development process, like the alchemical stages or Jung's individuation. And Marion Woodman's book is built upon that. Each chapter is on a different dress. And this is one, again, with a story like this, a fairy tale, a dream, an imaginal story, I don't think any interpretation is wrong, and they all amplify and echo each other. And the way that Marion Woodman interpreted it is the golden dress symbolizes the world of the father with the capital F, like being the golden child, being the treasured one, and also gold being the most prized and valued, and also she's associating this with like the mind and intellect and being able to perform to a certain standard to impress that world. Marion Woodman associates the silver dress with the body and the emotions and the world of the mother with a capital M. Again, archetypes, I'm saying like with capital letters, it's not just somebody's literal or physical mother, but the idea of mother or the idea of father. So the silver dress corresponds to that. Um, and the dress that's as bright as the stars is the integration or the fulfillment of these processes, the light and the dark, um, the the unity and the multitude within. And Marion Woodman also talks about like maiden mother crone too. You could see these as a development of a life cycle, and the dress being made of straw. The dress bright as the stars represents the fulfillment of wisdom that occurs in the later stages of life. Um, so there's a lot that I relate to personally in this story. And we were also talking in our conversation about this line, I'm only good enough to have boots thrown at my head, and what that looks like, the depths of self-deprecation that you get to. And we don't know. That's the whole thing. There's so much about this story, and I could spend hours talking about it. I'm really trying to limit myself. But one of the things too here is, at what point does the princess in disguise believe that about herself, or is she just saying that as part of this flirtatious game that she's playing with the king? And at what point do they both know it's a game and they're both playing it willingly? There's quite a bit of teasing happening here between them. That was one of the things that came into my mind about this. Um, I do think she believes that she's not good. And that part of that is probably the shame of having got her father's attention. And there's so much in this story about, I think, if you are desirable, if you are attractive, and you attract the wrong person, particularly if you're young and innocent, but you're in a culture that sexualizes youth and innocence, that you think it's your fault. So I think a lot of that, the hiding, the escape, and again, there's probably a lot of literal abusive situations that people face in childhood or beyond where they have this reaction to somebody else's inappropriateness or crossing a line, thinking that it's their fault. Um, and and then Marion Woodman really makes this point too, and it's very common in Jungian psychology and yeah, the schools that come after it, the depth psychology or post-Jungian, that in a fairy tale or any kind of these stories where there's a marriage, that it's not really about having a romantic partner in your quote unquote real life or waking life. It's not about finding your soulmate out there. It's about an inner marriage of, you could say masculine and feminine parts of your soul. If that imagery doesn't, don't connect with that, it's like an integration of parts that have previously been polarized, whether or not you want to think of them necessarily as masculine and feminine. But in fairy tales and kind of in the cultural psyche, it is, a heterosexual marriage, a king and a queen, a prince and a princess, that kind of thing. But here it's all furs is it's an inner partner. The correct partner was not her father. It wasn't the dying institution that's trying to cling on to the last bit of youth and beauty, and devour its own children. That to separate from that and to find unity and integrity of the parts of your soul after you've gone through an experience like this. And that's what the marriage to the king is about. And in my own life, there have been, whether professionally, like with my career, whether like in my personal life or living situations, or even my romantic life, there's been cycles of like this elevation of going to the ball, of of exposing your radiance, of really feeling that you're living your true self, followed by what in alchemy you might call the nigredo, like that, or anticlimax. And I've offered jobs and been turned them down, and then regretted it and felt like you know, I shouldn't have done that. I'm stupid. I'm only good enough to have boots thrown at my head. Um, I've also gone through a period in my life actually where I was really torn up about um, ending of a romantic situation. It was the period I was talking about earlier where I actually worked in a kitchen and I wore a hairnet and I felt like this character. I was doing some of the dirtiest work, and the chef in that kitchen, the head baker, reminded me so much of the cook in the story where um, he was a pretty stern person and he made me work, but any compliment I got from him, I know I earned it. And I think the cook in this story is kind of like a teacher or a guide for all furs, even if he doesn't realize he's filling that role for her and helping her on her journey. And um, I remember that, yeah, working in that kitchen and just sulking and having the hairnet and just being feeling like I was, completely desexualized, and that was fine. Just keep me here in the corner. I'll never need to love again. I'll never go to the ball again. Um, and I'll also share this, which is a bit about my personal life, but I've been sharing this more openly, which is uh, in 2020, I was diagnosed bipolar after experiencing my first and to date only manic episode. And that was like going to the ball on steroids, wearing all the dresses at once. But what I noticed in my own uh, kind of research and learning more about myself, and I'm not representative of everybody, obviously, that has the same diagnosis, and I'm not, trying to give medical advice or anything like that, just from my own experience. What I heard about commonly with people who are bipolar is they may not realize it until later in their adult life. They may never have a manic episode until then, or to whatever circumstances push them into that. But often they have cycles of like elevated productivity and happiness followed by a depressive cycle, where everything crashes and everything falls apart. And until 2020, I had experienced some highs, but really often lows. I was like chronically and cyclically depressed, even to the point where I just felt like I was good for nothing. Why would anyone want me anywhere? I couldn't do anything. Don't let me work for you. Don't let me, be in your class. I'm useless. I can't. And just that feeling, and I imagine it's like putting on the fur mantle or disguising yourself, letting yourself also wallow in your own filth too. Um, People who are depressed, and for me, can often go in that direction, uh, literally or psychically. Um, that reminds me so much of this story. And the fact that, I'm here now to tell this story at a point in my life where I feel like I've gained some sovereignty and some agency. I don't know if I've quite experienced, conjunctio, the intermarriage yet, but in my life and in this story, she comes back out of the kitchen. She keeps playing this game. And at some point, both her and the king know it's a game. So I also see the progression of hope and kind of coming into yourself, um, over time. Uh, and I think one of the things that keeps coming back to me about this story now, for a long time and for now, one was the fear that what if this new king is just like the old one? Did she just end up marrying her father again? Um, and again, that could be in your literal romantic relationships in life. Are you, consistently getting in relationships with someone who reminds you of a parental figure, and repeating the same pattern maybe as your own parents' relationship? But if you look at it on a psychic level, I'm like, well, if she's danced with this king this number of times, and I guess 30 minutes is a whole world in fairy tale time, you can do all these things in 30 minutes, fall in love with a person, be enchanted, whatever. Um, it's like, I guess by the time she goes, if she on the, third time's the charm, if she went upstairs and decided to wear that dress of stars, she must have known something was coming and she must have made up her mind to commit to this. And hopefully it was enough, she had enough experience with the new king to know that he wasn't like the old and to make that decision for herself. Um, the other thing that keeps coming back to me when I think about this story, Marion Woodman makes a little note. I think it's like the last line in this book, leaving her father's house, or the last line of one of the chapters is, what's to stop, the new queen from packing up everything and going off into the woods again? Maybe this institution, maybe this house or this palace isn't going to be the one for her either. And I was like, that's all well and good. I love the whole part, in the tree. That was the part that captivated me as a child. My thought was more, what's to stop her from going back into the kitchen? And is that appropriate for a queen or not? And as I think more about this and think about my own life and how much literal and metaphorical kitchen work it requires, it's like it doesn't stop. Maybe she never goes and sleeps in that cupboard again or um, deliberately wallows in filth or puts on this um, fur mantle. Maybe she never descends to the state of wretchedness, but if it's not her, somebody's in that kitchen doing the work. The work never stops. I guess for me, I have to be in a mindset. It's like, even if you're in the kitchen working in your on your subconscious or doing the day-to-day concrete tasks of self-care and survival, uh, you have to know you are the monarch in your life, not to be pulled back in to the idea of believing yourself a kitchen wretch. And I think that's a lot of what I'm working on, to try to find the space and the solitude to either do the self-care and the actual cooking and eating, or the inner kitchen work of reflecting, recalling my dreams, journaling, thinking about my decisions and how to improve them, or, reflect, analyzing my life. Um, that it's never, even when it's already finished, even when it's already fulfilled and completed and you've crossed the river and, um, you know, married the ruler, the fire still needs to be tended to. So I think that's all I'm going to say for today, because I could keep going on and on, but I'll pause there. All right, we're coming to the end. Um, So we just finished a writing exercise and shared that with each other. And I'm going to let Marion Woodman have the closing words for today. So this is also from the same book, Leaving My Father's House. And she says, "The image of sacred bonding is discovered in a bowl of bread soup. Bread is a powerful image of transformation. The seed that has died has become the new grain, which is winnowed and ground into flour. The spirit of the yeast is added, and hopefully the miracle happens. If it doesn't, the bread is dense, like matter without imagination. All furs makes the bread into soup. The soup is taken up the stairs from the kitchen to the king. It is a connecting link. In the Catholic Mass, physical bread through the mystery of sacrifice becomes spiritual bread. In the transformative process, something of immense value is sacrificed to something of even higher value. The bread as a symbol of the incarnation of spirit in matter embodies both the physical and the spiritual." So thank you, everyone who was listening and stayed with us thus far, and I'll stop it there.